Oh, hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time for Tet Odds and Ends. Alright, I've been putting this one off for a while for obvious reasons. I never actively look forward to making Odds and Ends videos since they're just to satisfy the completionist in me, and in this case, more to satisfy the completionist in other people, but whatever. I think it's about time I get back to Tet, and of course, given how much random stuff he's done on the side, outside of his main studio albums, he is the kind of artist who would need an Odds and Ends exploring it. Not only does he have archive compilations and random EPs under the Tet name that I didn't already cover, he's also got an album under the alias Percussions, he's got his work as part of the post-rock band Fridge, there were the albums he did under his own name in collaboration with Steve Reed, he's done a bit of production work for other artists and one-off collabs with Burial and Thom Yorke. It's gonna be a lot to cover. And there's even quite a bit that I'm leaving off. I mean, I'm not gonna be going through any of his remix work since that's way too much on its own. I'm not gonna talk about his stuff under that weird Wingdings alias since a lot of that material got repurposed into his Parallel album, and I can't imagine the stuff that didn't make the cut for that album is gonna be interesting enough to talk about in its own right. Also, it doesn't help that pronouncing all those titles is, like, literally an impossible task. He'd also put out quite a few singles on SoundCloud that I don't think are available anymore, and I will not be talking about those either. So sorry if you wanted to hear my musings on anti-racism tech house. Yeah, that's a thing. This won't be covering every random B-side of his that's ever existed. There's just too many loose tracks and not enough time to find all of them, so if there's a B-side that I missed that you happen to love, feel free to mention it in the comments or something. But Odds and Ends videos are already an absolute shit ton of work and are pretty much guaranteed to not perform well with the algorithm, so you get what you get. Alright? Alright, let's get into this. So, I'm going to start with the first project that Hebden ever released under the Tet name, a single called 3625 that is titled after its 36-minute and 25-second length. It's on his Bandcamp page, split up into two smaller parts, around 18 minutes each. It was clearly all meant to come together as one single unbroken piece. I'll admit I didn't have soaring expectations for this. I kind of threw it into this list because, hey, it's his first EP, probably not going to be anything special, or it maybe shows some kind of prototype form of a sound that's even less refined than Dialogue was. But even right from the very beginning here, Hebden already has his sound and style totally nailed down. It is clearly from his early sample-based era of work along the lines of those first three albums, and given the layout of the piece, it's obviously way more freeform and meandering than the material on the albums themselves, but the appeal of those early projects is very much intact, with the same sunny, pleasant, jazzy, meditative vibes he became known for. Hell, I probably like this more than the standard digital version of Dialogue. I don't think it's as good as the CD version of Dialogue, since that album's ending has enough good moments to equal this whole thing. Also, this project's final moments are its least interesting. The last 5-6 minutes or so are being dominated by these echoing, layered samples of someone saying, with buzzing stereo noises. that gets a bit repetitive and grating over time. And there's also like some chopped up piano and flute samples at the end from what sounds like something out of like the soundtrack to a Peanuts TV special. Also gets a bit repetitive, but that's at least more pleasant. But it's the main bulk of the piece, which is obviously the main draw. Mostly all these cool, atmospheric pads going over chopped-up, jazzy drum samples, and creating a pretty immersive, minimal groove in their own right, but also including sidetracks into bells, chiming, and sax solos, the drum samples being replaced with drum machines, and eventually the entire piece climaxing quite gloriously near the end, in a whole segment that sort of resembles his track The Butterfly Effect. Even if not every moment is as riveting as the next, this little EP is very much the kind of project that exemplifies all of early period Tet's greatest strengths, and pretty much entirely holds up from start to finish. Definitely worth seeking out. I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. And if you want even more material from the days of Tet's first three albums, or maybe more like first two albums, In 2013, he also put out an archive compilation called 0181 that takes a bunch of random unreleased material from 1997 to 2001 and splices it all together into one giant, unbroken 38-minute piece. Unlike the EP I just mentioned, you can tell that this piece was not initially conceived with this presentation in mind. It's clearly being stitched together out of lots of disparate demos that don't transition into each other at all, with nothing but hard cuts between them. But he did still create a similarly nice and pleasant listening experience out of all of it. You got like guitar pieces that sound pulled out of pauses sessions, and lots of jazz sample manipulations that would have fit right at home among Dialogue's track listing. Some moments which are a bit more experimental leaning, but other moments which are just as bright and cheery as always. Favorite moments include the mix of eerie pads and drum machines that kick us off right near the beginning. There's some great banging breaks around the 12-minute mark that totally switch up into this much more melancholy and moody piece by the 13-minute mark, and then another shuffling mix of old-timey jazzy loops by the 14-minute mark. There's a lively loop of horns, drums, and jazz guitars a little before the 20-minute mark, which is probably the single catchiest segment of the album. There's a particularly immersive watch of various chimes and bells around minute 25, a segment of pause-style acoustic guitars, and one of the odder-sounding drum breaks being joined by a lot of clattering chime-like noises around minute 28. And of course there's the low-key mix of bells that both serve as the album's immediate intro and eventually reprise about halfway through and serve as the one motif that makes this comp feel more like a complete whole. Oh, by the way, this is the only Tet side project that's gotten longer-term play out of me over the past several years. I picked it up thinking it was just a regular album back when I first found out who he was, and I didn't find out that it was just a comp of archive material until I'd already given it several spins. Even if it may just be a bunch of barely connected, unfinished track fragments, listening to this project still does make you feel like it's taking you on a journey of some kind and gives you a lot to explore and digest, and still could easily beat out some of his lower-ranked regular albums in terms of personal enjoyment. It's at least roughly on par with Pink, albeit obviously with completely different strengths. I still keep it around to this day, and I think any fans of his early material out to as well. I'll also give this a 7.5 out of 10. Oh, but on that topic, there is one other project that I heard back when I first found out who Tet was and initially marathoned his work for the first time. He had an EP in 2008 called Ringer, that sometimes gets classified as an album for some reason. I have no idea why, since it's 4 tracks and only runs on for like a half hour. This one, however, did not get longer-term staying power for me like 0181 did. I heard it once, found it mostly uninteresting, and then never listened to it again until revisiting it for this segment. Though coming back to it, I will say it was a little better than I remembered. This does kind of stand out as like a neat transitional moment for Tet from his early denser sample-based material and his later minimal tech house material. Not as complex or interesting as There's Lovin' You, which came out shortly after, though it does sort of hint at the direction he'd eventually go on with that album and Pink. If nothing else, I was struck by how much fun I had with the 10-minute title track, mainly based around a loop of some odd synth noises that sort of resemble like heavily processed violins or something. And the way they go up against the bleeping synth arpeggios and house beats is really nice. Did throw me off with the downbeat of the kicks popping in somewhere different from what I expected in the beginning. And then there's that whole section in the outro which has all these crashing drum breaks that's pretty epic too. Also quite liked the blossoming synth arpeggios of Ribbons going over its minimal house beats. Those were quite nice and refreshing. That might have made for a nicer filler track on Pink, too. Though I wasn't huge on the other 2 tracks. Swimmer entirely blended into the background with its glitchy pads and beats that didn't stick out to me. And Wing Body Wing sort of felt like a less memorable companion to Ribbons, with a more muted major key melodies and some really out-of-nowhere blaring synth stabs that come in later as an attempt to make things more interesting, though not really fitting in with the mix of the rest of the EP. And after hearing these less engaging takes on these sounds in the back half of the EP, it does make coming back to the better moments on it less fun or engaging somehow. There is material on Ringer that does make it worth at least one listen, and obviously none of it is outright, difficult to get through. But after a solid decade of him making absolutely no shortage of other material in this exact style, I can't say that Ringer is the kind of project that, stands out as among the very best he can deliver. More an interesting one-off transitional moment for him with 2 good tracks that can maybe fall short of greatness, and 2 meh tracks that just kind of take up space. Check out if you're curious, but it's not essential. Probably feeling like a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Another project that might be of similar interest is his Anna Painting EP from 2019, and this doesn't mark any new era for Hebden or show him doing anything you wouldn't already expect him to do. But even if this is only a 3-track project, that probably isn't anything essential or notable in the bigger scheme of his catalog. I still probably found it a marginally more fulfilling experience than Ringer, I guess. It doesn't have any amazing tracks, but nor does it have any mediocre ones. The least memorable one is Lahaina Noon, which sort of combines the mix of light and sunny melodic synth licks and house beats like much of the material on Ringer, but that one's at least good. And meanwhile, the title track is a really nice house cut in the same style. It has much better and more striking melodies, some echoing female vocals in the background, and even a few harpsichords for good measure. It's a very simple cut, but it's definitely one that leaves an impact. And Breath is not much more than a bunch of shifting ambient pads, but still definitely feeling like a climactic and refreshing finish to this little collection of ideas. I mean, it's not essential listening either. Most of it disappeared from my head immediately after listening to it, but it is well paced. It didn't leave me coming out of it thinking the ideas had gotten stale, even if they are all ideas he's done before. So if it caught your interest, there's some good stuff here. I can give it like a strong 6.7 out of 10. While we're on the topic of loose singles and EPs, I've admittedly skipped over much of the earlier loosies like the Pause EP since that was all remixes, or the No More Mosquitoes EP since I could only find one other track from it and I just could not be freaking bothered. But I did find an upload of an old single he did called I'm on Fire that some people asked me about. It is pretty neat to see like a bit of that micro house sound that would color his later work showing up on a really old track of his from 2002. And the Boards of Canada-esque melodies do create a nice dreamy vibe. It's out there if you're curious, but yeah, I'm just gonna move on from there. Next up, there's one more compilation he has called Randoms from 2016 that basically brings together a whole bunch of different one-off cuts that appeared on several other various artists' compilations or loose B-sides or commissions and other stuff like that. And these can date anywhere from like 1996 to 2013. And I can't be bothered to fully break down which tracks come from where, but like this wasn't him just digging through his archives. Everything on here had already been publicly released before to some extent. But anyway, this collection of 9 random tracks is really freaking good. I had no expectations this would be anything special given the context of its release, but I got way more out of it than I thought it was going to. There's nothing tying these tracks together. You can tell they all came out during completely different times, but honestly most of these tracks are rock solid and deliver a lot of cool creative ideas that wouldn't necessarily fit onto his main albums. And all of them are interesting moments in their own right. A track like MoMA sounded like it was just going to be some minimal synth piece like Peace for Earth, but quickly progressed and evolved through a lot of different sounds and making everything sound a lot deeper and more organic. Meanwhile, For These Times is mostly based around one repetitive sample, but creates a super tight groove around it. Pocket's minimal version has a lot of really simple loops of chopped up vibraphone sounds and sine wave synths forming triplet rhythms, but going up against these more lo-fi and somewhat abrasive bassy synth washes that end up giving it a more epic flair than you'd expect. Also worth checking out the original version of that single, which he recently made available separately on his Bandcamp page. Has a bit more like an abrasive folk rock sort of flair to it. And it definitely sounds like it could have fit alongside the material on, like, Everything Ecstatic. Anyway, Gilliam I Love You is a really interesting ambient piece made out of lots of stuttered guitar samples and whispering little kid voices. Feels a lot smoother and more emotionally resonant than you'd expect when these sounds are first introduced. The Reservoir is a neat little tech house cut with some chopped up voices in his usual style, though also containing these Asian guitar-like sounds. Can't pin down what instrument that actually is. And the vocal samples he uses are a lot livelier than the usual, like some kind of Indian folk band or something. Nothing to See was my least favorite of these cuts since its near 9-minute length felt a bit too drawn out and repetitive, and the stuttered sample that the groove is built out of gets grating eventually. Love Cry the Saint. But even that track has these cool sidetracks into like lo-fi analog synth melodies. It's still pretty nice. Field is the track from 1996 and the first thing he released under the Fortet name at all, and perhaps unsurprisingly it sounds like something off of Dialogue that was a bit too rough to make the cut for that project. But the way the jazz breaks and bassy road samples are stuttered makes for a pretty cool effect. It is still Fortet sound in prototype form, and those MIDI oboes do make it sound really cheap. But you can tell how much potential he had even this early on. Speaking of stuttering samples, that's what the last two tracks kind of focus on too. Especially both When I Am Alone and When We Are. Just a lot of snippets of acoustic guitars and drums chopped up into tiny pieces and glitching up so much I thought my internet connection was going on the blink, even though I was listening to it offline. And finally, the album ends with his cover of Jimi Hendrix's Castles Made of Sand, which perhaps unsurprisingly barely sounds like the original at all. It's like a formless load of acoustic guitars being played forward and in reverse, horns, flutes, random crashing cymbals and chimes. But it sounds great, and even pretty emotionally resonant despite its total lack of structure. It just goes to show how well he could do these kinds of electroacoustic pieces back in the day. And yeah, that's all of it. Randoms, unsurprisingly, is not cohesive enough to work as a proper album, but quality-wise it's got the material to back itself up and hold its own against the rest of his catalog. Maybe about on par with the original CD version of Dialogue. Definitely worth a shot for any fans of his. I think this gets a 7.7 out of 10 for me. From there, I guess I can touch on some material he's done under other aliases. There isn't going to be much to cover here, though someone asked me about a single he did under the name Joshua Falken called Falken's Maze back in 1998. And I will bring it up since it does sound really different from anything else he's done. Sounds like some cheap 80s movie theme with like the big punchy drum machines and analog synth pads. I think it's all being sampled, and I'm told the entire thing is supposed to be a reference to the movie War Games, which I have not seen, but whatever. It is very retro in a way that none of his other stuff is, and it is quite fun. And the track's B-side called Chase HQ is a lot more laid back, with lots of clattering 909 percussion going over loops of moody electric pianos and a few melancholy trumpet solos. If not for the chaotic percussion, we could have something that might have fit alongside his other early Fortet work, though still not the kind of thing I'd be able to recognize was him from a distance. So, that's a thing that also exists, but, yeah. While we're on the topic of alternate aliases, I think it's more important to mention this one compilation he put out back in 2015 under a different alias called Percussions, that collects all the material he made under that name from 2011 until 2014, and titled as such. And even including some, like, unreleased stuff from that period, enough to make something album-length out of it. I do remember paying attention to him when this actually dropped and even downloading it, but I never actually got around to listening to it, I guess since I knew it was a side project, and I guess I figured it wasn't going to be as interesting as a main album or something, I don't know. But obviously I did finally get around to it for this video, and I mean, if you want Hebden making the most straightforward tech house material he's ever done, that's pretty much what you're gonna get on 2011 until 2014. There is a part of me who wants to say this thing has the feeling of a side project. It's a little thrown together and doesn't have any major standout tracks. Though honestly, if this project had been released as a plain old mainline Fortet album, I don't think anyone would have really blinked either. His music was already going in this direction around that time, with projects like Pink and Beautiful Rewind, and those albums are only slightly more well-structured than this one. And especially now, after having gotten the album Parallel, which pretty much serves the exact same purpose for his Wingdings alias, just as thrown together and even more misshapen, and somehow that qualifies as a main album? I don't know, but yeah, this project's fine. Got some tracks I like, some I don't like, and some I don't really care about one way or the other. The minimal tech house progressions of tracks like February 2014, Sext, January 2014, Bird Songs, and Rabbit Songs, they mostly just blend in the background for me. Even if Sext has some really solid grooves, I did like the outro of Rabbit Songs, where all the house and techno elements bleed away into more acoustic percussion playing the same rhythms, and frankly sounding even better. Meanwhile, you also get a couple of tracks that actively grate on my nerves. The choppy samples on Blatant Water Cannon don't really play into the groove as well as they could and end up feeling really jerky and awkward and kinda annoying. And that repetitive flute riff on November 2011, I mean, I guess it sounds interesting at first, but it is basically just one descending note played over and over, and it gets old in record time. Oh, the project did have its share of highlights. The bubbly synth progressions on March 2013 sounded really cool, left me really wishing that track ran on even longer than it did. As did the marginally catchy analog synth sequences on October 2011, those sounded really good. There's a track on here called KHLHI that appears to be the most popular track on here by a long shot, and it is definitely one of my favorites. Taking this banging and refreshing tech house beat and bringing in this old soul sample or something that just sounds fantastic. I think I'll keep it like this. So it did really have me wishing that sample actually played a bigger role in the track than it did. It's a great sample, but there's not enough of it on this track. But easily my favorite cut on here had to be ASCII-Bot, which kind of feels like foreshadowing towards what he did with the track Love Salad later, and might even be better. It's like a lot of these bright, trance-like melodic progressions that run through most of it and really capture my attention, and bringing in other layers of melodic textures and synth bass and even another sample that gives the track some more sense of atmosphere. And at no point do the melodies go away entirely to make way for just regular old club beats as many of these other tracks do. It remains engaging through its full 8.5 minutes. Excellent track. It's just a shame the rest of the project can't really compete with it. None of the other cuts on here came particularly close to it quality-wise, in my opinion. It's definitely not his best work as a whole. A lot of it, you can tell, is among his earliest brushes with this style of super straightforward tech house, and much of it wasn't that interesting. But it does have a more club-ready flavor to it that none of his main albums do. And if I did have to qualify it as a main album, I'll tell you what, I'd still probably rank it higher than Beautiful Rewind. This gets a 6.7 out of 10 for me. Oh yeah, and he did release another track under this alias called Digital Arpeggios that you can find on his Bandcamp page. It's not as good as ASCII-Bot, but it is quite solid and would have been another highlight if it had been included on that comp. But moving on from there, we're now going to talk about some of the material that Hebden worked on in collaboration with other people. And I think we ought to start with his work in the post-rock band Fridge. Fridge comprises the trio of Hebden, Adam Ilon, and Sam Jeffers. They have 5 studio albums, and I'm going to briefly discuss all of them, electronic or not. Most of them are not really electronic, but whatever. Now, the first 2 projects are not nearly as widely available as the others. You're not going to find them on streaming services or Bandcamp or the usual places. I had to do a bit of digging in order to find them. But it didn't feel right to skip them entirely, since this is basically the beginning of Hebden's music career at all. The 3 of them were just schoolmates, and these projects did actually get a decent amount of attention, so they are still an important part of the Fortet story. The band's even mentioned in the second sentence of his Wikipedia article. I'm not going to talk about, Fridge's, singles and rarities compilations, but just the main 5 albums. Now, when it comes to their debut from 1997, Ceefax over here, this definitely sounds like the product of a bunch of 20-year-old college mates who like experimental rock forming a band and putting out their first ever work. I mean, it's certainly not unlistenable or outright tedious to get through or anything, but the production is super low budget sounding, the grooves are very stiff and blocky, if they exist at all, and emotionally, there's really not much there either. Maybe a few nice acoustic guitar riffs and shoegaze-ish moments where they intentionally let all the audio fuzz overtake everything. And there are some krautrock-esque experimental synth effects and random samples, I guess, but it's just all around a dull and flat listen that gives me very little to actually say about it. It all fell into the background. There is only one track that really caught my attention, Robots in Disguise. That one had some horns and flutes to give it a mildly jazzy flavor. That one was nice. But everything else on here was just kind of boring, and you're probably not missing anything from its lack of wider availability. 5.7 out of 10 on that one. Now, as for their follow-up in 1998, Semaphore, it's pretty much just the exact same album again, though it is a little better. There's a stronger sense of groove to it. The melodies and performances feel like they have more heart put into them. Production's still not very good and has the same sort of thrown-together DIY feeling. And it also runs on longer and didn't really have enough variety to justify it. Still mostly fell in the background without leaving much of any impression on me. But I guess it did at least have its moments. The album started pretty strong with the first 3 tracks, Cassette being a really quick but energetic album intro, Furniture Boy having much more of that experimental edge with all the drums having weird filtering and some of the trumpet lines coming back, and A Slow fittingly being a nice emotional little slow jam number. I also liked the kind of off-key saxophone on Low-Fat Diet going over its sparse bass lines, and the closer Michael Knight was also a solid way to close the project out. Very nice, sparse and melancholy low-key vibes created by that one. though pretty much every track in between those latter two had totally lost my attention. I did find that this album, on average, was at its best when it got, like, more contemplative and lower key, see most of the material in the first half, and it was at its worst when it tried to focus more on plain rock guitars that had a rougher and grungier aesthetic. Tracks like Swerve and Spin completely fell flat for me, for instance, mostly because the recording fidelity of said guitars just sounded so flat and monotone. Heck, I think they are actually, like, recorded in mono with the other guitars sounding a bit more like stereo. It's just not a good mix. I could be wrong about that, but there is, like, a weird problem with stereo depth on this project. Not to mention, the addition of drum machines on a few tracks, like Stamper or Motor Bus, while they can add some texture, it doesn't feel like enough. The album's just too meandering and thinly produced to really grab me or feel like the kind of thing I'd want to come back to. But hey, this had like 5 or 6 pretty decent tracks. That still puts it above the debut that really only had the one. This is probably also skippable in the long run, but it's an improvement. I can give it a 6.3 out of 10. Now, Fridge's third album, F, from 1999. This is the first one that's actually available on streaming services and the like. Heck, the version that seems to be most widely available is an expanded reissue that has an entire second disc of B-sides and remixes, which I opted not to listen to for the sake of not further dragging this video out. But whatever. I will say that it's a good thing that this is the first Fridge album that's easy to find, since it also happens to be the first one that I actually really liked. Heck, it's almost certainly my favorite of their 5 albums. I mean, the performance and arrangements are about as low energy and meandering as they were on Semaphore, but first of all, they focused their sound on the parts of that album that I enjoyed the most, the lower key and more contemplative material to which these more meandering arrangements are not a hindrance. And on top of that, the production is much better. The synths and drum machines are cleaner, they feel like they have more of a purpose beyond experimental window dressing, the live drums and guitars are more crisp sounding and blend way better both with each other and with all the other sounds in the mix. Not to mention, the album only having 8 tracks means there's no room for filler on here, and they deliver. Both bringing their A-game to the longer form pieces like Arc and Aphelion, which have a sense of epicness to them and some steady progression. Love the way the former kind of evolves from like this clean little synth piece into eventually turning into something like Stereolab's Metronomic Underground. And the way that Aphelion has like all these really cool violins and bass lines, those are both great. And they nailed all the tracks in between too, like the sunny guitar plucking and banging beats of which seemed to be a hint towards the stuff Hebden would go on to do on Pause. The overdramatic melodic lines of Transients, the emotive and well-textured electro-jazz mixes of Bad Ishul, the more playful drum machine loops going up against lighter bell and electric pianos on Yttrium, even the interludes like the progressing synth work on Mium and the ambient breather Tomb, they feel like they add something of substance to this project. They're not just there. Some of these tracks even directly segue into each other, which is something I can always appreciate. It feels like the fully realized version of what they were trying to do before without the old scrappy garage band feel, and with those more electronic and experimental elements actually giving them more of a recognizable identity, and an appeal that overlaps a lot more with Fortet's earlier sample-based material. It's even well-polished and focused enough where Fortet's solo stuff probably would have felt more like the side project at that particular point in time. I can legit see myself hanging on to this longer term. This gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10. Might become an 8 if I listen to it more. And Fridge kept up the quality for their 4th album in 2001 called Happiness, the first ever full-length release on Hebden's self-managed indie label Text Records, and a project that can stick out to you pretty immediately through the fact that every track on the album is named after the instruments used to make them. Well, sort of. They aren't named after the only instruments used to make them. For example, melodica and trombone also has a lot of like tambourines and shakers, but it does in fact focus its sound on melodica and trombone. And sometimes the title is only barely accurate. The long singing on Long Singing is like way in the background and is otherwise like just a fairly traditional post-rock tune, with focus being placed on the drums and guitars and some occasional horns. Not the singing. But whatever. As for the music itself, this feels a lot more cerebral and experimental than any of their previous stuff, a lot more minimalistic in its sound design, and a lot more sonically all over the place and disjointed, while being just as compositionally freeform. Now, while this is just as spot-on production-wise as F, if not even better in that department, my actual personal enjoyment was not quite as consistent. well, still more consistent than Semaphore. All of it was at least pleasant to have on, and still had some interesting and striking ideas behind even its worst moments. But some moments definitely hit me more than others. Moments like the above-mentioned melodica and trombone, or drums, bass, sonic, and edits just kind of meandered aimlessly, even if the latter had one pretty dang cool section in the beginning that had all these bleepy melodies I really liked. Though that part eventually got abandoned for some less exciting excursions. There were tracks like Sample and Clicks, or Harmonics, which, while nice, felt really thin and simplistic and just kind of there. But there were also some mood-brightening post-rock tunes like 5/4 Child Voice and the already mentioned Long Singing, the latter made for a very nice and satisfying finish to this thing. And nothing on this album really knocked it out of the park like the second and third track on here did. Drum Machines and Glockenspiels is a 13-minute jam with a rock-solid groove that steadily marches along and had me fully invested the whole time. And Cut Up Piano and Xylophone delivers exactly what it says on the tin and sounds absolutely freaking gorgeous along the way. Really had me wishing that track lasted longer than just 2.5 minutes. I mean, as a whole, Happiness is a good album, if definitely not a great one. It's too all over the place to fully work for me on the level that F did, and I probably won't be keeping it around either, at least not in its full entirety. But I can definitely at least recommend giving it a shot. The standouts on here are definitely worth the trouble, and the lowlights, while again not exactly attention-grabbing, at least all sound good for what they are, so I guess I can give it like a light 7.3 out of 10. And one more Fridge album. In 2007, we got their fifth album, The Sun, their first after a fairly long break, and their last before unofficially going on indefinite hiatus and not releasing any new music since. And this album answers the question, what if we got an album like Semaphore that actually sounded good? I mean, musically, it's pretty back to basics for them, going back to straightforward instrumental rock and even bringing back a lot of those more distorted guitar textures and stiff, blocky grooves that characterized their earlier work. But my god, does the improved production quality go a long way. Now the louder and more energetic moments actually feel like they have some energy behind them. The whole album feels so much livelier and more emotionally involved. Everyone sounds like they're having more fun than they did before. Even if I'm sure they were having fun with their early albums too. This time they're not being handicapped by inconsistent recording fidelity anymore, and it's just way more fun to listen to. I admittedly don't have a lot to actually break down about it. Pretty much the entire first half of this album blends together as if it were all one continuous piece. Until maybe like you got the track Oram, where the drumming gets way more chaotic and freeform, and all these beautiful little bell sounds show up to fill some of the space. And from there, the album does have a few more broken up ideas, like the more electronic focus of Comets, or the mix of jazz instrumentation with light acoustic guitars and twinkling chimes on Insects, or the melancholy acoustic tearjerker that is the closer Years and Years and Years and Years. But yeah, this thing is super consistent and kept my attention the whole way through. It's just a project that can put me in a good mood, and I don't really have to think about too hard. I do think F was more musically adventurous, and I might have preferred a bit more, but this hit the strongest emotional note for me that any Fridge album did. And if it turns out that this was Fridge's swan song and Hebden has no further plans to go back and revive the project again, which I kinda have the feeling is the case despite no official confirmation one way or the other, you know what, if it is their last hurrah, they went out on a high note, feeling a strong 7.7 out of 10 on this as well. So now that I've made it through all his stuff with Fridge, let's talk about some of his other work in collaboration with other people. Like the one time he produced an entire album for a totally different artist, Neneh Cherry's 2018 album, Broken Politics. We are really just like rapidly skipping around on time in this video with no linear progression, but whatever. I'll admit I'm not super familiar with Neneh Cherry's work. I know she's been around since the 80s, but the only other thing that I've heard from her was that guest appearance she made on The Avalanche's Wherever You Go, and I've not heard any of her other albums. But given Hebden handled all of the production on here, I figured I should put it here and give it a shot. He did also apparently co-produce her 2014 album Blank Project, though his credit on that one seems to mostly be relegated to like mixing and mastering and that kind of thing, while he was a lot more directly involved in the actual creation of Broken Politics to the point of even being given co-writing credits on every track. Though feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about that, if I was really missing something by skipping over Blank Project. Anyway, this album, it's a fairly low-key trip-hop sort of project. Hebden making most of the backing tracks out of loops and samples. ranging from his usual more ambient-centric stuff you'd expect with plenty of harp samples, to some more thumping and percussive stuff, and kinda stealing the show. He's the main reason to check this out. Really don't have anything to complain about his contributions, aside from the air horns on the track Natural Skin Deep, which are laughably out of place. That sound effect is only ever going to be an outdated meme to me, and makes no sense on an otherwise low-key album like this. Though the way he uses that sound to transition into a sax solo is a pretty cool moment, and the beat he put together on that track with all the steel drums and fluttering synth effects could have been one of my favorites on here otherwise. Now, as far as Neneh Cherry's presence on this album, well, she's a good singer and a pretty decent rapper too. She's generally likable and interesting enough, and I would not have guessed that she's actually like my dad's age. Though she does occasionally leave me kind of emotionally detached in a way that I can't really put my finger on. And the lyrics had a couple of weird moments, like on Synchronized Devotion, where she needs to mention that she's a Pisces, like 5 times, and mentioning her birth date, and that was just kind of awkward. She does also have tracks like Shotgun Shack, which sort of touch on gun violence in America. That one's pretty cool, but the lyrics on this album mostly seem to concern her own personal anxieties and don't really get that political often, despite the album's title. Well, I admittedly couldn't be bothered to read super deeply into the lyrics, since this is just an odds and ends segments in the video about the album's producer. Maybe there's something more there I missed, I don't know. The album was cool, though. A nice and refreshing listen, I suppose. Like a 6.5 out of 10. Just kind of wish it elicited stronger feelings out of me than it did. Another collaboration of note that I've gotten requests to discuss is that latest Madlib project, Sound Ancestors. Kieran Hebden is credited with arranging the project himself right on the album cover, though by arranging that doesn't mean he added to the project in a direct musical capacity. This isn't like that time he just did a whole EP of, like, remixes from Madvillain where he just made, like, full-on new beats for Doom's verses, even including a remix that has him and MF Doom even making a new beat together. That EP was actually a thing that happened, and it's about as good as it sounds. But yeah, this project, Hebden wasn't making new beats for Madlib. He arranged it as in he went through Madlib's archives and sequenced a bunch of his unreleased beats together to form a proper album, and mastered the whole thing as well. I'll admit that I don't listen to a lot of Madlib myself. My experience with him is mostly relegated to, you know, the obvious one. But I have been well aware for years of his reputation as one of the all-time great hip-hop producers. Most of the reviews I've seen of this project market is pretty good, if not incredible, or even pretty lukewarm. And, you know, I'll admit that it is certainly no J Dilla's Donuts, but, you know what, maybe my lack of familiarity with Madlib's greater catalog worked to my benefit, since, you know what, quite frankly, this could easily work in a pinch if I am in that same mood to listen to something in a similar vein to Dilla. I thought it was quite good and pretty consistent across the board. It's just a lot of very simple sample loops that create this very nice sense of atmosphere and open space, but delivering quite a bit of sonic variety out of all the source material Madlib pulls from, and it all flows together really well too. Heck, some of these tracks that have a bit more of like a freeform experimental ambient edge like Hop Rock, the title track, or Latino Negro, do actually kind of feel like the thing you might see out of Tet's earlier projects, and they blend well with the kind of more straightforward instrumental hip-hop cuts like The Call and Road of the Lonely Ones, or ones that had a quirky off-kilter feel like Loose Goose that probably would have fit alongside the instrumentals on Madvillain. And while I've seen people say that this thing does kind of trail off in its back half, I don't actually agree. The track 2 for Dilla is excellent, and is just as much of an emotional high point for me as Road of the Lonely Ones was for most people. And there's moments like Chino, which has a really bright and sunny vibe to it, or The New Normal, which has all those weird airy pads and buzzing bass line, which made for a really interesting effect that stood out. And that closer Doombaye, with its predominantly African textures, made for a solid closer too. While I'm not sure if I could qualify this as properly great, may need to keep it around a while and see if it gets more staying power throughout the year. But I can hang on to this. I had a lot of fun with it. I think this collab went over really dang well. It was a fun change of pace for this marathon too. I can give it a nice 7.5 out of 10. Next collab's worth noting. You know how Tet was part of a band with his schoolmates for a while? There was another schoolmate of his that he made a handful of one-off tracks with over the years. And you may have heard of him. Just this one guy who goes by the name Burial. In 2009, they made 2 tracks together called Moth and Wolf Cub. In 2012, they made another called Nova. Oh yeah, and they did 4 more together, which also features some fairly obscure singer called Thom Yorke, who definitely hasn't done anything else of note as far as I can tell. In 2011, the 3 of them made 2 tracks called Ego and Mirror, and right at the end of last year, they did 2 more called Her Revolution and His Rope. And none of these 7 tracks have any actual artwork. They're blank pictures of black vinyl is all I got. But yeah, all these tracks are really freaking nice. Moth is mostly built around one repetitive loop of shifting synth pads that does feel quite emotive, but has a solid groove to it. And Wolf Cub is much more lighter and happier sounding. The mix of Burial's typical style of heavy banging beats and reverby pitched up vocal samples, with Tet's airy loops of blinking kalimba sounds coming together quite well, even if it is really dang obvious who contributes what parts. And Nova might actually be the best of all of them, blending their styles a lot more seamlessly and creating a mix that is both dark and atmospheric, but also with a sense of lighter optimism and that more organic edge. The melodic progressions and barely present vocal samples have a lot of emotion put into them, and there's just a fantastic sense of open space created with the whole thing. It's excellent. As for the tracks with Thom Yorke, they're also pretty good, if not eliciting as strong a reaction. Ego shifts its sound around a lot between dark and atmospheric, and letting Yorke's voice layer on top of itself as if in a giant echo chamber, and later switching over to some different sections driven by some very pretty classical piano samples. And Mirror, well, Tet's influence on that one isn't particularly felt. Mostly sounds like Yorke's moody crooning in the typical dark subspaces you'd expect out of Burial. Maybe with a bit more organic and acoustic edge to the drum textures than usual from that guy. But that's cool too. And Yorke has an even more central role to Her Revolution and His Rope. Those 2 tracks sonically come a lot closer to Thom Yorke's solo work, and end up even feeling like some experimental or glitchier take on, like, old-school trip-hop. They're pretty interesting, though I don't know if I'm going to want to come back to them a lot. In either case, all these tracks are worth giving a shot. The stuff Burial and Tet did without Thom Yorke resonated with me a lot more, but all of it is nice. And going on from there, I also got to talk about the projects Hebden made under his own name in collaboration with jazz drummer Steve Reed. They made 4 entire albums together before Reed's unfortunate passing in 2010. In 2006, they released the 2 volumes of The Exchange Session, each of which consisted of 3 long-form free jazz improvisational pieces. These 2 projects came out pretty shortly after Hebden finished Everything Ecstatic, and shows him very much going into these with the same sort of mindset and approach that he brought to that album. Reed's non-stop chaotic drumming being joined by a lot of abrasive experimental synth work, lots of incoherent spleeps and whirs everywhere, but still some occasional wailing trumpets and maybe a kalimba loop or 2 and that kind of stuff for at least a little bit of emotional core. And to say that this is a challenging listen is kind of an understatement. I mean, while I enjoy all the individual ingredients that go into these projects, just the complete lack of structure or any sort of tune or groove got exhausting for me. These tracks just go on and don't feel like they ever go anywhere all that exciting, and the abrasiveness of the electronics and completely unrelenting drum tracks just completely wear out on me. I mean, I can respect what they're doing, it is just pure free jazz, and with absolutely no edits or overdubs. It would take a heck of a lot to keep someone invested for the long and meandering passages these projects take you on. It is pretty dang ambitious. And some people have, in fact, gotten into it more than I have. I definitely see the appeal. Maybe if I were in a specific enough mood for this stuff, it might have been able to connect better with me. And I do think Volume 2 oddly connected with me more than Volume 1 did. Despite running on longer, the pieces on there felt like they had a bit more progression and were less likely to abandon the more melodic elements. It was a marginally more welcoming listen and did a better job on average at actually setting a mood, but yeah, not gonna lie, as respectable as this no-holds-bar approach could be, these were mostly kind of a chore to get through. Like, Volume 1 gets a solid 5, and Volume 2 gets a solid 6. Now, their third album together from 2007, Tongues, I was a little more excited to hear this one after getting through the Exchange Session, since it's laid out more like a traditional album with 10 songs between 2 and 7 minutes, most of them under 5 minutes. It looked to be a more approachable listen, and it definitely was, though more approachable does not mean more simplistic or stripped back. This is still a pretty out there mix of free jazz and krautrock era experimental electronics that often gets just as abrasive and weird. But the more conventional pacing prevents these ideas from feeling like they're getting beaten into the ground, and basically ends up with this feeling like a more extreme companion to everything ecstatic. The album does still mostly lose my interest past the track Rhythm Dance. Everything afterwards ends up kind of feeling like filler, but it's not outright exhausting to get through anymore. There are tracks like The Sun Never Sets and Our Time, which have a bit more melody involved in all the crazy mess of experimental improvisations and feel like they happen to stumble upon some semblance of structure. Those tended to be higher points for me. And there's also a track where Hebden plays a music box set to play Greensleeves and credits it as a cover of that song. I don't think I would have figured out it was a cover otherwise, but yeah, this album, it's pretty neat for what it is, has plenty of solid moments, though I'm not going to act like I'm so enamored with the soundplay on display here that I see myself coming back to it, probably feeling like a 6.7 out of 10. Finally, one last album from Hebden and Reed in 2008. This one was called NYC, and it has a fairly trim set of 6 tracks, which range from just under 6 minutes to 9.5 minutes. We've gotten closer and closer to me getting something more out of this free jazz experimental approach the projects with these two have been focusing on. And at long last, we finally have one that actually ended up properly connecting with me. It is still just as musically out there as the other 3 albums, and focusing on a lot of freeform experimental synth noises and shuffling drum performances, though this time there's a bit of a loose concept with each track named after some different location in New York, which leads to these tracks feeling like they have more of a sense of purpose than the other Hebden and Reed material. Makes all the experimental oddities feel like they fit for the anxious and constantly busy atmosphere of New York City, and it's especially aided by the fact that these tracks seem to actually form grooves. Even if these tracks may almost seem like the same loops repeating constantly throughout their entire running time, with not that much in the way of progression beyond some of Hebden's synths changing texture or Reed's drum performances rising or falling in energy, just having everything nailed down to coherent pulses made a huge difference. Having these repetitive bass lines or minimal guitar lines or something to actually give these pieces a sense of structure made them feel like they were always going somewhere even if they weren't really. Tracks like Lyman Place with its chugging synth bass going over the chaotic drums and constantly rising synths that sound like a car engine speeding up faster and faster. That's legit epic. Or the bright-stuttered kalimba samples of Departure, or Between B and C with its somewhat more heartfelt repetitive guitar riff, going up against all these glittering clusters of synth melodies feeling especially refreshing. Moments like these made more freeform and less structured tracks like Arrival or 25th Street made that much easier to swallow. Even these tracks were still pretty good. I mean, I still don't know if I could say I, absolutely love it, but I'm glad Hebden and Reed managed to get one project that I did legit enjoy enough to see myself hanging on to and coming back to. Like all those experiments finally coalesced into something that felt fully formed. If you only listen to one album from their partnership, this is the one to check out, feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. And now, to finally close this video out, I'm going to talk about Tet's most recent work. Just a month ago, he released a track in collaboration with Skrillex, of all freaking people, also featuring Stara. The track's called Butterflies, and yeah, it's really freaking good. Easily my favorite thing I've heard out of Skrillex since, maybe the Recess album. It turns out he can pull off this kind of deep house pretty effectively, and I'm sure having Tet on board probably helped. But even if the track does have a lot of his hallmarks, like, the kalimba breakdown, the shimmering vocal chops going over that guy's typical minimal house beats, but it does still feel like Skrillex's track first and foremost. Tet doesn't usually sound this poppy or commercial or ready-made for EDM radio stations, kind of like this is. But this certainly does work on the same level that most of Tet's work in the past decade or so can. Would not mind seeing an actual Skrillex comeback if it means getting tracks this good again. Oh yeah, and do make sure you seek out the extended mix of this track. It does have better build-up and construction than the more widely available radio edit. But that's going to be all the Tet I have to discuss. I know there's still more in his catalog that this video didn't cover, other loose singles and that kind of thing, but this is all I have the patience to sit down and write about, and I just wanted this freaking odds and ends to be out there and done with. We'll still be doing a top 10 and a worst to best ranking for him, so you can look forward to that in the near-ish future, and those are a lot more fun for me to actually make, so they're probably not going to take nearly as long as this video did to actually come out. But yeah, I'll leave it all at that. Of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. So leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.